The autumn light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Callahan's Riverside Bistro, casting long golden rectangles across the polished hardwood floors. Daniel Harrison sat across from his 7-year-old daughter Grace, watching her small fingers navigate a chicken tender through a pool of honey mustard with the focused determination only children possess. The restaurant hummed with the comfortable murmur of Saturday lunch crowds, families celebrating nothing in particular, couples stealing quiet moments between errands, elderly regulars claiming their usual corner tables. Daniel had chosen this place deliberately, as he did every week. The brass plaque near the entrance read, "Established 1987 by Henry Callahan." And though Henry had been gone for 3 years now, Daniel still felt the old man's presence in every beam of light, every worn floorboard, every scratch on the oak bar, where Henry had spent decades polishing glasses and dispensing wisdom to anyone who needed it. Grace looked up from her plate, a streak of honey mustard decorating her chin like war paint. Her dark curls, inherited from her mother who had died bringing her into the world, bounced as she tilted her head with that peculiar intensity children develop when something captures their complete attention. Daniel followed her gaze toward the hostess stand near the entrance, where 2 figures stood in silhouette against the afternoon light streaming through the front windows. A woman in a faded blue dress that might have been pretty once before too many washes had stolen its color, stood with her hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a small girl. The child could not have been more than with tangled blonde curls that suggested mornings too rushed for proper brushing and eyes that seemed too large for her thin face. The woman was studying the menu board with an expression Daniel recognized immediately, a look he had worn himself in darker days, the careful calculation of someone translating prices into meals, skipped bills, unpaid, impossible choices between dignity and survival. Her lips moved slightly as she read, and Daniel could almost hear the mental arithmetic, the desperate hope that anything might fall within reach. The little girl tugged at her mother's dress, pointing towards something Daniel could not see, and the woman shook her head with a gentleness that could not quite mask the pain beneath it. Then the child turned, and her eyes found Grace's plate. Daniel had seen hunger before. He had felt it himself, that hollow ache that gnaws at your insides until you cannot think of anything else. But seeing it in a child's eyes struck something deep in his chest, a resonance that vibrated through years of carefully constructed success to find the raw nerve of memory buried beneath. The little girl did not look away. She stared at the golden chicken tenders, the crispy fries, the small dish of fruit that Grace had barely touched, with an intensity that spoke of more than simple want. This was need primal and undisguised, the kind of hunger that strips away pretense and leaves only truth. Grace noticed too. She set down her fork and leaned across the table, her voice dropping to a whisper that was not quite quiet enough. "Daddy, why is that little girl looking at my food like that?" Daniel reached across and wiped the honey mustard from her chin with his napkin, buying himself a moment to choose words that would make sense to a 7-year-old without breaking her heart. "Maybe she's just curious. Sweetheart, sometimes people look at things they like." But Grace had inherited more than her mother's curls. She had inherited her mother's sharp perception, that ability to see through comfortable explanations to the uncomfortable truths beneath. "She looks hungry, Daddy. Really hungry. Like how Buster looks when we forget to feed him breakfast." Buster was their golden retriever, a ridiculous name for a dignified animal, but Grace had been 3 when they adopted him, and her vocabulary had been limited. The comparison was not elegant, but it was accurate in the way only children can be, cutting through adult complexity to find the simple heart of things. Daniel looked back at the hostess stand, where the woman was now speaking with the hostess, her posture tightening with each word exchanged. The hostess was consulting her seating chart with the apologetic efficiency of someone delivering bad news, and Daniel watched the woman's shoulders inch upward toward her ears, a defensive posture he knew intimately. The hostess gestured toward a table near the back, partially hidden behind a decorative partition. The woman nodded and took her daughter's hand, leading her through the restaurant with quick steps that suggested she wanted to minimize the time spent under public observation. As they passed Daniel's table, the little girl's eyes never left Grace's plate. The longing in that gaze was so naked, so purely desperate, that Daniel felt it like a physical blow to his chest. They disappeared behind the partition, and Daniel forced himself to return his attention to Grace, who was now pushing her fries around her plate with unusual solemnity. "Are you not hungry anymore, sweetheart?" I was thinking maybe I could share, Grace said slowly, working through the idea she spoke. Like how you always say sharing is good. Maybe she would like some of my fries because I have too many anyway and my tummy is getting full. The simplicity of childhood generosity, uncomplicated by adult calculations of propriety and pride, made Daniel's throat tighten. He had spent years building walls between himself and the poverty of his past, constructing an identity as Daniel Harrison's successful consultant, respected businessman, pillar of the community. But his daughter in her innocent wisdom had cut through all of that with a single suggestion. Perhaps the walls he had built so carefully were not protection at all, but prison bars of his own making. That's a very kind thought, Daniel said carefully. But sometimes people feel embarrassed about accepting help from strangers. It can make them feel like there's something wrong with them, even when there isn't. Grace considered this with the grave seriousness she brought to all complex problems. But if they're hungry and we have food, isn't it mean not to share? It's not mean exactly, it's just complicated. Adults have feelings about things that don't always make sense. Grown-ups are weird, Grace concluded, returning to her fries with renewed purpose. I'm going to eat all of these so they don't go to waste, but I think it's silly that you can't just give food to hungry people without making them feel bad. Daniel watched her eat, his mind churning with memories he usually kept locked in the basement of his consciousness. 20 years ago, he had been the one standing at restaurant doors, calculating whether the cheapest item on the menu was worth the humiliation of counting coins in public. 20 years ago, he had held a baby Grace in his arms and wondered how he was going to feed her, clothe her, keep her safe when he could barely keep himself alive. The distance between that desperate young father and the successful businessman he had become seemed simultaneously vast and paper-thin, as though all his achievements were just a costume that could be stripped away at any moment to reveal the frightened man beneath. A commotion near the back of the restaurant drew his attention. The woman in the faded blue dress was standing abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through the comfortable murmur of conversation. The waiter was leaning close, speaking in low tones that could not quite mask the apologetic nature of his words. Daniel watched as the woman fumbled with her purse, counting bills and coins, with trembling hands, her face cycling through expressions of humiliation, frustration, and finally devastating acceptance. She took her daughter's hand and began walking toward the exit, her stride quick and purposeful, the stride of someone desperate to escape before the tears started falling. The little girl looked back, once her eyes finding Grace's plate one final time, and in that look, Daniel saw himself at 5 years old, standing outside a bakery with his mother, watching other children through the window as they received treats that might as well have been on the moon for all the chance he had of tasting them. Something inside him shifted, a tectonic movement in the carefully constructed landscape of his soul. "Stay here, honey," he said to Grace, already rising from his chair. "I need to talk to someone for just a minute." He moved through the restaurant with the focused determination that had built his consulting empire, navigating between tables and servers with practiced efficiency. The woman was already at the door when he reached her, one hand on the brass handle, the other gripping her daughter's fingers with protective intensity. Her face was turned away from the dining room, and in the rigid set of her shoulders, Daniel could read the effort it was taking to hold herself together. "Excuse me," he said, pitching his voice low enough to offer privacy. "Please wait just a moment." She froze with her hand on the door, and when she turned to face him, her eyes held a wariness that went beyond simple surprise. This was the guarded watchfulness of someone who had learned through painful experience that strangers rarely brought good news, that kindness often came with hidden costs, that the world was full of people who would exploit vulnerability for their own purposes. The little girl pressed closer to her mother's leg, peering up at Daniel with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "I couldn't help noticing you and your daughter," Daniel continued, choosing his words with care. "I'm here with my little girl and we'd love some company for lunch. Would you like to join us? We have plenty of food and Grace would enjoy meeting someone her age." The transformation in the woman's expression was immediate and complete. The wariness hardened into something cold and fierce, the protective anger of a mother whose instincts had been triggered. Her arm tightened around her daughter's shoulders, drawing the child closer as though shielding her from a physical threat. "No." The word came out sharp enough to draw glances from nearby tables. "We're fine. We don't need your charity." "I didn't mean to offend you. I just thought—" "I know exactly what you thought." Her voice had dropped to a fierce whisper, but the intensity was undiminished. You thought you'd play the hero, swoop in and rescue the poor woman who couldn't afford lunch. Well, we don't need rescuing, not by you, not by anyone. That wasn't my intention. They never think that's their intention. Something flickered in her eyes, a flash of old pain that suggested this conversation was touching wounds far deeper than a single restaurant encounter. But it always is. There's always a price. There's always something they want in return. And the answer is no. It will always be no. She pushed through the door before Daniel could respond, dragging her daughter with her into the afternoon sunlight. The little girl looked back once through the glass, and the confusion in her young face made Daniel's chest ache. She did not understand what had just happened. She only knew that there had been food, and now they were leaving without it, and her mother was upset in ways that children can sense but cannot comprehend. Daniel stood at the door for a long moment, watching them walk down the sidewalk until they disappeared around a corner. The rejection stung, but not in the way he might have expected. It was not his pride that hurt. It was the recognition that he had approached the situation all wrong, that his instinct to help had been shaped by his own needs rather than hers. He had wanted to feel good about himself, to play the generous benefactor, without considering how that role required her to play the grateful recipient. He had offered her a transaction disguised as kindness, and she had seen through the disguise immediately. He returned to the table where Grace was waiting with worried eyes. Is the little girl okay, Daddy? She looked sad when she left. I hope so, sweetheart. I tried to help, but her mother didn't want our help right now. Why not? You were being nice. Sometimes being nice isn't enough, Daniel said, settling back into his chair. Sometimes people have been hurt by other people who pretended to be nice, and it makes them afraid to trust anyone, even people who really do want to help. Grace absorbed this with the thoughtful silence that meant she was filing the information away for future reference. That's sad, she finally said. I hope someone helps them, even if they're scared. Me too, baby, me too. They finished their meal in relative quiet, but Daniel's mind was elsewhere. As he paid the check, leaving an especially generous tip in case the waiter had taken any grief for the earlier scene, he found himself thinking about the woman's eyes. Not the anger, though, that had been formidable, but the flash of pain beneath it. That had been the look of someone who had trusted before and been betrayed, someone who had learned through bitter experience that help came with strings attached. He knew that look. He had worn it himself once before. A man named Henry Callahan had shown him that genuine compassion still existed in the world. The drive home wound through the older neighborhoods of Riverside, past the modest houses and struggling businesses that existed just blocks away from the renovated historic district where Daniel now lived. Grace chattered about her upcoming school project, something involving the life cycle of butterflies, but Daniel's attention kept drifting to the rearview mirror, to the streets falling away behind them, to the somewhere out there where a mother and daughter were going hungry because he had not known how to offer help without making it feel like pity. Their house was a restored Victorian on Maple Street, painted the same deep blue it had been when the original owner built it in 1892. Daniel had bought it 5 years ago when his consulting business had grown large enough to make such extravagances possible, but he still felt slightly fraudulent every time he walked through the front door. The house was beautiful with its wraparound porch and original woodwork, but it never quite felt like home. Home in Daniel's emotional vocabulary was still a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper, the smell of his mother's cheap perfume mixing with a perpetual must of poverty. Home was a rusted Honda Civic with a baby car seat in the back, parked behind the Callahan's Riverside Bistro, where Henry had let him sleep in the alley during those desperate first months. Home was anywhere that fear lived, because for most of his life, fear had been his most reliable companion. Grace ran ahead to greet Buster, who was performing his usual enthusiastic welcome dance at the front window. Daniel followed more slowly, pausing on the porch to look back at the street. The afternoon light was softening toward evening, painting the neighborhood in shades of gold and amber. It was peaceful, prosperous, exactly the kind of life he had dreamed of during those long nights in the car with baby Grace. But the peace felt fragile now, as though the woman's words at the restaurant had cracked something in the foundation of his contentment. There's always a price, she had said. There's always something they want in return. The words echoed in his mind as he entered the house, as he started dinner, as he helped Grace with her homework and read her a bedtime story. She had spoken with such certainty, such bitter conviction. Someone had taught her that lesson through pain, had taken advantage of her vulnerability in ways that had left permanent scars. Daniel wanted to know who. He wanted to understand what had happened to make a woman so young already so closed off to human kindness. And he wanted against all reason to prove her wrong. That night, after Grace was asleep and the house had settled into its familiar creaks and saws, Daniel sat in his study with a glass of bourbon and a photograph he rarely looked at anymore. It showed two men standing in front of Callahan's Riverside Bistro, the sign newly painted, the windows sparkling in what must have been morning light. One was Henry Callahan, his hair still dark, then his smile the same warm beacon that had guided Daniel through his darkest years. The other was Daniel himself, though he barely recognized the gaunt young man with the haunted eyes and the desperate grip on hope. He had been 23 when that photo was taken, working the dishwashing station while baby Grace slept in a portable crib in Henry's office. He had been one bad day away from losing everything, and Henry had saved him. Not with charity, but with dignity. Not with handouts, but with opportunity. "You taught me that real help doesn't diminish people," Daniel said to the photograph, his voice barely above a whisper. "I forgot that today. I made that woman feel small, even though I was trying to do the opposite. I need to do better, Henry. I need to find a way to help that doesn't hurt." The photograph offered no answers, but Daniel had not expected any. Henry's wisdom lived in his memory now, in the countless conversations they had shared over the years, in the example of a life lived in service to others. Henry had once told him that the hardest part of helping someone was setting aside your own need to feel helpful. "It's not about you," he had said. "It's never about you. The moment you make it about how generous you are, how good you're being, you've already failed." Real help is invisible. Real help meets people where they are, not where you want them to be. Daniel had not understood that fully until today. He had approached the woman with his own needs leading the way. The need to feel like a good person, the need to distance himself from his own painful past, the need to prove that he had not forgotten where he came from. He had made his offer about himself, and she had recognized that instantly. Whatever had happened to her, it had given her radar for that kind of self-serving kindness. He would do better. He did not know how yet, but he would find a way. The image of that little girl's hungry eyes would not let him rest until he did. The following days brought the usual demands of running a successful consulting firm. Harrison Consulting Group occupied the top floor of the Landmark building downtown, a renovated textile factory that had been converted to office space during the city's Renaissance. Daniel had built the company from nothing over 15 years, starting with a single client and a borrowed desk in a shared workspace, growing it through dedication and skill into one of the region's most respected consulting practices. They specialized in helping small businesses navigate growth, providing the kind of strategic guidance that larger firms could not afford. Daniel's own experience with struggle had given him insight into the challenges facing entrepreneurs, and his clients valued that understanding as much as his technical expertise. Margaret Holloway had been with him since the beginning, a 68-year-old force of nature who ran the office with military precision and the kind of motherly concern that made her simultaneously the most intimidating and most beloved member of the team. She had been a legal secretary before retirement had driven her out of her mind with boredom, and she had responded to Daniel's first classified ad with a handwritten letter that explained in no uncertain terms why she was the only choice for the position. She had been right. Margaret knew where every file was remembered, every client's birthday, and could spot a mistake in a contract from across the room. She was also the only person in the office who could tell Daniel when he was being an idiot and have him thank her for it. "You look terrible," she informed him when he walked through the door on Monday morning. "Did you sleep at all this weekend?" "Some," Daniel admitted, accepting the coffee she pressed into his hands. "I had a lot on my mind. The Hendricks proposal, because I already called them to push the deadline. They were fine with it, more than fine actually. Apparently their CFO is on vacation until next week anyway." "It's not the Hendricks proposal." Daniel paused outside his office door, debating how much to share. Margaret had known him long enough to have earned his trust, but this felt different somehow. More personal than their usual exchanges about work and clients and the mundane machinery of business. "I met someone at the restaurant Saturday, a woman with a young daughter. They were hungry, really hungry, and I tried to help. She turned me down, forcefully. Margaret's expression shifted from professional concern to something more personal. And now you can't stop thinking about her. Not like that, Daniel said quickly. There's nothing romantic about it. I just keep seeing her daughter's face, the hunger in her eyes, and I keep wondering what happened to make her mother so closed off to any kind of help. Maybe something awful, Margaret said, her voice gentler than usual. Maybe she met someone who offered help and then made her pay for it in ways that left scars. It happens more often than people like to think. That's what I'm afraid of. Daniel took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest. Henry would have known how to handle it. He always knew the right thing to do, the right way to approach people so they didn't feel like projects or problems. I apparently still have a lot to learn. Henry was a rare man, Margaret agreed, but you are more like him than you give yourself credit for. You'll figure this out. Just don't push too hard. If she's as scared as you think, pushing will only drive her further away. Daniel nodded and retreated to his office, but Margaret's words stayed with him throughout the morning. Don't push too hard. It was simple advice, but it ran counter to everything his business experience had taught him. In consulting, pushing was how you got results. You identified problems, developed solutions, and drove implementation with relentless determination. But people were not business problems. You could not solve them with strategic frameworks and project timelines. You could only show up again and again and hope that consistency would eventually become trust. The thought sparked an idea. He could not approach the woman directly, she had made that clear, but he could make himself available in the spaces she might occupy. Not intrusively, just present. Visible without being threatening. Available without being demanding. It was the strategy Henry had used with him all those years ago. Henry had not pushed Daniel to accept help. He had simply been there day after day until Daniel's walls had crumbled enough to let him in. Over the next week, Daniel began reshaping his lunch routine. Instead of eating at his desk or meeting clients at upscale restaurants, he started visiting Riverside Park, a sprawling green space that occupied several blocks near the commercial district. The park was a popular destination for families with playgrounds and walking trails, and a small pond where children fed ducks in warmer weather. It was exactly the kind of place a mother with a young daughter might spend time on a budget, offering free entertainment and open space without requiring money that could not be spared. For 3 days, he saw nothing. He sat on benches with a book he barely read, watching children play and parents watch, and couples walk hand in hand along the winding paths. Grace was at school, and he had arranged his schedule to allow these extended lunch breaks, telling Margaret he needed time to think about the Hendricks proposal. She had not believed him. Margaret never missed anything, but she had not pressed for details either. She understood in her quiet way that he was working through something important. On Thursday, he found them. The woman was sitting on a bench near the largest playground, her posture alert and watchful as her daughter pumped her legs on the swings. The late morning light caught the blonde curls that Daniel remembered from the restaurant, now slightly more tangled than before, bouncing with each arc of the swing. The woman had the same faded blue dress, though she had added a cardigan that might once have been white, but had faded to a creamy yellow. Even from a distance, Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes tracked her daughter's movements with an intensity that spoke of fear as much as love. He chose a bench on the far side of the playground, far enough to avoid appearing predatory, but close enough that she would eventually notice him. He opened his book, a biography of Theodore Roosevelt that Tom Bradley had recommended months ago, and pretended to read while watching her from the corner of his eye. She noticed him almost immediately. He saw the stiffening of her spine, the sharp turn of her head, the moment of recognition followed by the visible effort to appear unaffected. She did not leave, but she did not relax either. She sat frozen in her watchfulness, a mother protecting her young from a potential threat. Daniel gave her space. He did not approach, did not wave, did not acknowledge her presence in any way. He simply sat with his book and watched the children play and let the autumn sun warm his face. After perhaps 20 minutes, the woman stood abruptly and called to her daughter. The little girl protested. Daniel could hear the high, disappointed whine that all children produce when fun is cut short, but her mother was insistent. They left the playground through the opposite gate, the woman's stride quick and purposeful, her daughter struggling to keep up. Daniel did not follow. He stayed on his bench until they were out of sight, then closed his book and sat for a while longer thinking. She had recognized him. That was significant. It meant she had been thinking about him too, replaying their encounter at the restaurant with the same obsessive analysis that had kept him up at night. And she had left rather than confront him again, which suggested that her anger had cooled enough to make room for other emotions. Fear, perhaps, or confusion. Or maybe beneath all of that, a tiny flicker of curiosity about the stranger who had offered help and accepted rejection with grace. The next day he returned to the same bench. She was not there. He stayed for an hour anyway, reading his book and enjoying the crisp autumn air, then returned to the office without any sense of failure. This was not a campaign with deadlines and deliverables. This was a slow process of presence, of showing up without expectation, of proving through consistency that he was not a threat. She appeared again on Monday, this time at a different bench closer to the duck pond. Her daughter was throwing breadcrumbs to a persistent mob of mallards, laughing with the pure joy that children find in simple things. Daniel took his usual spot near the playground and did not look at her directly. He could feel her awareness of him like a physical pressure, the weight of her attention pressing against the side of his face, but he kept his eyes on his book and his body language carefully neutral. This time she did not leave immediately. She stayed for nearly an hour, watching her daughter play, occasionally glancing in Daniel's direction with an expression he could not quite read. When she finally gathered the little girl and headed toward the exit, she passed within a few feet of his bench. Close enough for him to see the exhaustion in her eyes, the dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights, the careful dignity with which she carried her poverty. Close enough, too, for her to see him clearly, to study his face without the pressure of direct confrontation. He looked up as she passed and offered a small nod, nothing more. Acknowledgement without demand. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then continued on her way without returning the gesture. But she had hesitated. That was something. The pattern continued for 2 weeks. Daniel came to the park almost every day, always taking the same bench, always bringing his book, always giving her space. Sometimes she was there, sometimes she was not. When she was, the distance between them seemed to shrink almost imperceptibly. 10 feet, then 8, then 5. She never spoke to him, and he never spoke to her, but the silence between them shifted gradually from hostile to wary to something that might, with enough time, become comfortable. It was her daughter who broke the stalemate. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, the little girl ran toward a particularly bold squirrel that had ventured onto the playground, chasing it across the wood chips with gleeful determination. The squirrel made its escape up a nearby oak tree, and the girl's pursuit carried her past Daniel's bench before her mother could intervene. She stopped short when she saw him, recognition flickering in her young face. "You're the man from the restaurant," she announced with the unfiltered directness of childhood. "The one with the chicken tenders." Sophie, her mother, was there in an instant, her hand closing around the girl's arm with protective firmness. "We don't bother people." "I'm not bothering," Sophie protested. "I'm just saying hi. That's polite." Daniel closed his book and smiled at the girl, careful to keep his attention on her rather than her mother. "You have a good memory. Yes, I was at the restaurant that day. My daughter had the chicken tenders. Her name is Grace." "That's a pretty name." Sophie's eyes brightened with the enthusiasm of discovery. "Does she like swings? I love swings. Mama pushes me really high, but not too high because she worries." "That's what good mamas do," Daniel said gently. "They worry because they love you." The woman's grip on Sophie's arm loosened slightly. She was watching him with an expression that was harder to read than before, less hostile, but no less wary. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of children playing and birds singing and the wind rustling through the oak leaves. "Grace loves swings too," Daniel continued, speaking to Sophie, but aware of her mother listening. "She goes to school just across the street. Sometimes I bring her here after school to play." "Maybe we could play together sometime," Sophie said hopefully. "I don't have any friends here yet. We just moved." "Sophie," her mother's voice was gentle but firm. "Come here, baby." She drew the girl close, wrapping one arm around her shoulders in a gesture that was both loving and territorial. For a long moment she looked at Daniel directly, her eyes searching his face for something, threat perhaps, or deception, or the hidden agenda she clearly expected to find. He met her gaze steadily, letting her see whatever she needed to see, offering nothing but openness and patience. "I appreciate that you've been respectful," she finally said. "Not pushing, not forcing conversation. But I need you to understand something. I can't accept help from people. I've made that mistake before, and it cost me everything. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Daniel could only guess at. She had offered him more in that single sentence than in all their previous encounters, combined not just information but a glimpse of the wound that shaped her wariness. Someone had helped her before, and that help had come with a cost that still shaped every interaction she had with strangers. I understand, Daniel said quietly. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just here because I like this park and my daughter's school's nearby. If you'd rather I sat somewhere else, I will. She shook her head slightly as though the offer surprised her. No, it's a public park. You can sit wherever you want. Can I ask your name, just so I know what to call you if we talk again? She hesitated, the internal debate visible in her eyes. Trust warring with caution, hope struggling against fear. Finally, she spoke. Rebecca, most people call me Becca. I'm Daniel. It's nice to officially meet you, Becca, and you, Sophie. Sophie grinned up at him with the uncomplicated warmth of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid of strangers. Nice to meet you too, Mr. Daniel. Becca tugged gently at her daughter's hand, signaling that the conversation was over. But before she turned to go, she paused and looked at Daniel one more time. Why do you keep coming here, really? The question deserved an honest answer. Because I've been where you are. Not exactly, but close enough to recognize it. 20 years ago, I was a single father with no job, sleeping in my car, wondering how I was going to feed my baby daughter. A man helped me, not with charity, but with opportunity. He gave me my first job, treated me with respect, never made me feel like I owed him anything except honest work. I've been looking for ways to pay that forward ever since. Something shifted in Becca's expression, not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in the wall of suspicion she had built around herself. She nodded once, acknowledging his words without accepting them, and led Sophie away toward the park exit. Daniel watched them go, the mother's quick stride and the daughter's reluctant backward glances, until they disappeared around a bend in the path. It was not much. A name, a moment of connection, a single crack in the armor. But it was more than he had dared hope for, and it was a start. He found himself thinking about Becca constantly in the days that followed. Not with the obsessive intensity of romantic attraction. He had loved Grace's mother, and part of him would always belong to her memory, but with a different kind of preoccupation. He thought about the fear in her eyes and wondered who had put it there. He thought about the way she watched Sophie with such fierce protectiveness and wondered what threats she had learned to defend against. He thought about the phrase, "It cost me everything," and wondered what everything had looked like, what had been lost, how deep the wounds went. The answers came as these things often do, unexpectedly. It was 3 weeks after their first real conversation on an unseasonably warm October afternoon that felt more like summer's last gasp than autumn's arrival. Daniel had settled into his usual bench with his book, and Becca had taken her usual spot near the duck pond, the invisible boundary between them now reduced to perhaps 10 feet. Sophie was on the swings, pumping her legs with determined focus, her blonde curls flying like streamers behind her. The normalcy of the scene had lulled Daniel into a state of peaceful distraction, his mind wandering through work problems and dinner plans, and the logistics of Grace's upcoming birthday party. And then Becca was beside him, standing at the edge of his bench with an expression that was neither hostile nor welcoming, but something more complex. Resigned, perhaps, or tired of carrying something alone. "Can I sit?" she asked. Daniel moved his book and nodded, heart quickening, with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. She lowered herself onto the far end of the bench, maintaining as much distance as the wooden slats allowed, her eyes still tracking Sophie's movements on the swings. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was different than before, expectant rather than empty, charged with words waiting to be spoken. 2 years ago, Becca began, her voice low and careful. Sophie's father left, just walked out one morning without saying goodbye. No explanation, no forwarding address, nothing. One day he was there, and the next day he was gone, and I was alone with a 3-year-old and no idea how to survive. Daniel said nothing. He kept his eyes on Sophie, giving Becca the gift of speaking without being watched. I'd been staying home with Sophie since she was born. That's what we'd agreed. I would be the primary caregiver while he worked, and we'd revisit when she started school. So when he left, I had no recent work experience, no references, nothing to put on a resume except 3 years of changing diapers and reading picture books. I applied everywhere. Fast food retail cleaning services. Nobody wanted to hire someone who'd been out of the workforce that long. Her voice remained steady, but Daniel could hear the effort it took to maintain that steadiness. These were not easy memories. They were the kind of memories that left scars that shaped every decision that followed. We were going to lose our apartment. I was 3 weeks away from eviction, no savings, no family. I could ask for help. Sophie was asking why we couldn't buy groceries anymore, why we were eating rice and beans every night, why I was always crying when I thought she was asleep. And I didn't have answers. I just had fear and shame and this desperate hope that something would change before we ended up on the street. Sophie had stopped swinging and was now making her way toward the duck pond, drawn by a particularly bold mallard that had waddled away from the water. Becca watched her with eyes that softened momentarily, love cutting through the pain of the story she was telling. Then I met a man named Victor Crane. The name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward through the silence. Daniel felt the shift in Becca's energy, the way her body tensed at the mere mention of the name. Whoever Victor Crane was, he was the wound that had shaped her wariness. He was the reason she could not trust kindness, could not accept help, could not believe that anyone would give without expecting something in return. He owned several businesses in the area, real estate mostly, but some retail too. He came into the coffee shop where I'd finally found a part-time job, minimum wage, not enough hours to pay the bills, but better than nothing. He was charming, successful, handsome in that polished way that comes from money and confidence. He started coming in every morning, always ordering the same thing, always finding reasons to talk to me. After a few weeks, he said he'd heard about my situation, small-town people talk, and he wanted to help. Daniel felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. He could see where this was going, could trace the contours of the trap before Becca even described it. It was a story as old as exploitation itself, dressed in different clothes, but always following the same pattern. He offered me a jump. Real work, he said, not coffee shop wages. Administrative assistant at his real estate office. Good pay, flexible hours, so I could be there when Sophie got out of daycare, benefits, the whole package. It seemed like a miracle, like someone had finally heard my prayers and sent an answer. Sophie had found a stick and was trying to coax the mallard closer with it, her small face scrunched in concentration. The duck was having none of it, maintaining a wary distance while still hoping for breadcrumbs. At first, everything was fine. The job was real. The paychecks cleared. Victor was professional, respectful, exactly what he'd seemed to be in the coffee shop. I started to relax. I started to think maybe I'd finally caught a break, that not everyone in the world was out to take advantage of people in desperate situations. The word started hung in the air, its implication clear. Whatever had seemed fine had not stayed that way. Then he began asking for things, small things at first. Could I stay late to finish a project? Could I pick up lunch for a client meeting? Could I wear something a little more professional to the office party? Each request came with a reminder of how much he'd done for me, how grateful I should be, how lucky I was that he'd taken a chance on someone in my situation. I told myself it was normal. Bosses ask employees for things. That's just how work is. Her hands were clenched in her lap now, the knuckles white with tension. Daniel wanted to reach out to offer comfort, but he knew better. This was her story to tell, and she needed to tell it without interruption. But the requests kept growing. Bigger things, more personal things. Have dinner with him after work to discuss a project. Attend a weekend conference as his assistant. Let him drive me home when my car was in the shop. Each time I said yes, the next request was a little more intimate, a little more demanding. And each time I hesitated, he reminded me of everything he'd done, everything I owed him, how easily he could take it all away. Sophie had given up on the duck and was now examining a pile of leaves with the intense focus of a 5-year-old scientist. Becca's eyes never left her daughter, as though the sight of Sophie's innocent play was the only thing keeping her grounded in the present. When I finally said no, really no, the kind of no that couldn't be bargained away, he changed. The charm disappeared. The professional facade crumbled. He told me I owed him. He said he'd taken a risk hiring someone like me, someone desperate and unemployable. And if I wanted to keep my job, I needed to show my appreciation. in ways that had nothing to do with work. Daniel's hands had curled into fists at his sides. He did not trust himself to speak, not without the anger he was feeling bleeding into his voice. This Victor Crane had taken a vulnerable woman and systematically stripped away her agency, using her desperation as leverage to exploit her. It was one of the oldest predatory patterns in existence, dressed up in the language of charity and opportunity, and Daniel felt sick with rage at the thought of it. I quit that same day, walked out of his office, and never went back. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I could just start over, find another job, move on with my life. But Victor wasn't the kind of man who accepted being told no. She paused, and in the silence, Daniel could hear the tremor beneath her controlled voice, the echo of fear that still shaped her days even now. He made phone calls to every business in town, to every contact in his network, to anyone who might consider hiring me. He told them I was unstable, unreliable, that I'd made accusations against him when he'd only tried to help. Nobody would touch me after that. I applied to 50 jobs in 3 months and got rejected from every single one. We lost the apartment, spent 4 months in a shelter before I found work at a laundromat under the table cash only. The pay was terrible and the hours were worse, but at least I didn't owe anyone anything. At least nobody could hold favors over my head and demand payment. Sophie was running now, chasing a squirrel across the grass with the tireless energy of childhood. Becca watched her with an expression that mixed love and grief in equal measure. Love for the daughter, she would do anything to protect; grief for the childhood innocence that had been shadowed by her mother's trauma. That's why I couldn't accept help from you at the restaurant. That's why I've been keeping my distance, even though you've been kind and patient and nothing like Victor. Because I learned the hard way that help always comes with strings attached. Kindness is just another word for leverage. And no matter how generous someone seems, they're always keeping track of what you owe them. She turned to look at him for the first time since she'd started speaking, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I know that's not fair to you. I know you probably really were just trying to be nice. But I can't take that risk. Not again. Not with Sophie depending on me. Daniel let the silence stretch for a moment, giving her words room to settle. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and steady. What Victor did to you was not help. It was manipulation. It was predation. He saw someone vulnerable and used her desperation to try to take things he had no right to take. That's not kindness, that's abuse. Becca's jaw tightened. I know that. I'm not stupid, but knowing it intellectually doesn't change the way I feel every time someone offers me something. The fear is still there, the waiting for the other shoe to drop. I understand, Daniel said. Better than you might think. She looked at him with something like curiosity, the first crack in her certainty that she was the only one who had ever faced such darkness. I told you I was sleeping in my car with my daughter 20 years ago. What I didn't tell you was why. Daniel turned his gaze toward the duck pond, finding it easier to speak without meeting her eyes. Grace's mother died, giving birth to her. Complications they couldn't have predicted. One minute we were expecting our baby, and the next minute I was alone with a newborn and a grief so big I couldn't see around it. The words came slowly, each one weighted with memory. I'd been working for a consulting firm, just starting out, not making much, but getting by. When Sarah died, I fell apart. Couldn't focus, couldn't meet deadlines, couldn't pretend that anything mattered except the tiny human who had cost me everything I loved. They let me go after 3 months. Said they understood, said it wasn't personal, said they just couldn't carry someone who wasn't performing. Sophie had tired of squirrel chasing and was now investigating a pile of acorns beneath a nearby oak. Her golden curls caught the afternoon light, and Daniel felt a wave of tenderness for the child who reminded him so much of Grace at that age, resilient, curious, innocent of the adult pain that swirled around her. Without a job, I couldn't pay rent, couldn't afford daycare, couldn't afford anything except the bare minimum to keep Grace alive. I sold everything I had, and when that ran out, I started living in my car. There's a particular kind of shame that comes with that, parking in different spots every night, so you don't get caught timing your movements to avoid notice, pretending during the day that you're just a normal person going about your business when really you have nowhere to go. He paused, the memories pressing against him with familiar weight. I would have done anything for Grace. Anything. and that desperation made me vulnerable to exactly the kind of exploitation you experienced. There were people who offered help, a place to stay, a chance to make some quick money, opportunities that seemed too good to be true. Most of them wanted something in return, things I wasn't willing to give, even at my most desperate. Becca was watching him now with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition, or the first stirrings of something that might eventually become trust. Then I met Henry Callahan. He owned the restaurant where we had lunch where we first met. Back then, it was just a diner on the edge of town, nothing fancy, but it had a reputation for treating people right. I went in one day because they had a sign in the window for a dishwasher, and I'd been turned down everywhere else. Henry took one look at me, unshaved, unwashed, carrying a crying baby, and instead of showing me the door, he sat me down and made me a meal. Daniel smiled at the memory, the warmth of it cutting through the grief. He didn't ask what I was doing there, didn't ask why I had a baby in a restaurant applying for a job. He just fed me, and when I was done, he told me the dishwashing position was mine if I wanted it. He said I could bring Grace to work if I needed to. He'd set up a space in his office with a crib and toys, and he'd pay me a fair wage for honest work. Nothing more, nothing less. That sounds too good to be true, Becca said softly. That's exactly what I thought. For weeks, I kept waiting for the catch, waiting for Henry to reveal what he really wanted, what I was going to have to give up in exchange for his kindness. But the catch never came. He paid me what he'd promised. He let me bring Grace. He never once made me feel like I was in his debt, like I owed him anything beyond showing up and doing my job. Sophie had found a companion, a boy about her age who had wandered over from the playground, and the two of them were now engaged in an intense negotiation over who got to throw bread to the ducks. Their voices drifted across the grass, high and happy, untouched by the weight of adult burdens. Henry taught me that real help doesn't diminish people, Daniel continued. It doesn't create obligations or keep score. It sees someone struggling and offers what they need without making them feel small for needing it. That distinction changed my life. It's the reason I have a company now, a home, a life worth living. And it's the reason I've spent the last 15 years trying to pay forward what he gave me. He turned to face Becca directly. I can't promise you that I'm different from Victor. Words are cheap, and he probably said all the right things too. But I want you to know that I understand why you don't trust me. I understand why you can't accept help. And I'm not asking you to change that today or tomorrow or ever. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that maybe somewhere in the world there are people who help because it's the right thing to do, not because they want something back. Becca was silent for a long moment, her eyes moving between Daniel's face and Sophie's distant figure. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. How do I know you're not just better at the game than Victor was? You don't, Daniel admitted. You can't know. Trust has to be built over time through actions, not words. So I'm not asking you to trust me now. I'm just asking you to not close the door completely, to let me be here in this park without expecting anything to happen. And if someday you decide that maybe I'm not a threat, we can talk about what comes next. She nodded slowly, the gesture neither acceptance nor rejection, but something in between. I should get Sophie home. We have things to do. Of course, Daniel stood as she did, maintaining the careful distance that had become their custom. It was good to talk to you, Becca. Really talk. She hesitated, then turned to face him one more time. Daniel, why does this matter so much to you? We're strangers. You have your own life, your own problems. Why do you care what happens to Sophie and me? The question deserved an honest answer, even if the honest answer was complicated. Because Henry cared about me when he had no reason to. Because I see in you the same fear I felt 20 years ago, the same determination to protect your daughter no matter what it cost. Because Sophie deserves a chance to grow up without hunger and fear, and you deserve a chance to rebuild without looking over your shoulder. And because when it comes right down to it, I believe that's how the world gets better. Not through grand gestures or political movements, but through individual people choosing to help each other one life at a time. Becca's eyes glistened, and for a moment Daniel thought she might cry. But she held herself together with the same fierce determination she brought to everything, nodding once before turning to call Sophie. Sophie, baby, time to go. The little girl looked up from her duck negotiations, her face falling with the disappointment of interrupted play. But she came obediently when her mother called, taking Becca's hand and falling into step beside her. As they walked toward the park exit, Sophie looked back over her shoulder and waved at Daniel with the unself-conscious friendliness of childhood. He waved back and something in his chest loosened ever so slightly. The walls were not down yet. They might never come down completely, but there were cracks in them now, and through those cracks, he could see the possibility of something better, the possibility of trust. The pattern continued for 2 more weeks, but the texture of it had changed. Becca still kept her distance, still watched Daniel with the wariness of someone expecting betrayal. But now there was a thread of connection beneath the caution. She no longer left when he arrived. Sometimes she even nodded in greeting, a small acknowledgement of his presence that felt like progress. Sophie, unburdened by her mother's learned fears, had no such reservations. She waved at Daniel every time she saw him, and when Becca was distracted, she would sometimes run over to tell him about her day, the bugs she had found, the games she had invented, the dreams she had dreamed. Daniel learned more about their lives through these stolen moments. They were living in a single room at the motor lodge on the edge of town, the kind of place that rented by the week to people who couldn't afford first and last month's rent on an apartment. Becca was still working at the laundromat 12-hour shifts for less than minimum wage, but she was saving what she could. Sophie was in the free pre-K program at the elementary school, which gave Becca a few hours each morning to work the early shift. They were surviving barely, but surviving was not the same as living. The idea came to Daniel gradually shaped by his conversations with Becca and his memories of Henry and his growing understanding of what she needed most. Not charity, she would never accept charity, but opportunity. The same thing Henry had given him all those years ago, a chance to work to earn, to build something better without feeling indebted. Harrison Consulting Group was growing. The Hendricks account had come through along with 2 new clients who had heard about Daniel's work through word of mouth. Margaret was stretched thin, managing the office, while also handling scheduling and correspondence, and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a business running. Tom Bradley, Daniel's partner, had been suggesting for months that they hire an administrative assistant, someone to take the routine work off Margaret's plate. The timing, Daniel realized, was perfect, but he could not simply offer Becca a job. She would refuse instantly, seeing it as charity dressed in professional clothing. He needed to give her the chance to earn the position, to prove herself through her own skills rather than his generosity. The offer had to be about what she could do, not about what she needed. He waited for the right moment. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Becca had told him about Victor. The weather had turned crisp, the first real cold snap of the season, and Sophie was bundled in a coat that was slightly too small, the sleeves ending an inch above her wrists. Becca was wearing the same cardigan she always wore now, accessorized with a scarf that looked hand-knitted and well-loved. They were at their usual spot near the duck pond, but Sophie had grown bored with the ducks and was exploring the edge of the woods that bordered the park. Daniel walked over to Becca's bench and gestured toward the empty space beside her. "May I?" She nodded, and he sat maintaining a respectful distance. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said carefully. "Not as a favor, not as charity, as a business proposition." Becca's expression immediately grew guarded. "I'm not interested in—" "Hear me out," Daniel interrupted gently. "Please, if you don't like what I have to say, you can tell me no, and we'll never speak of it again. But I think you should at least listen." She hesitated, then nodded, once her jaw tight. "My company is growing faster than we can manage. We need someone to handle administrative work, scheduling, correspondence, file management, the routine tasks that keep an office running. It's real work with real responsibilities, and it pays a fair wage. Benefits after 90 days. Flexible hours when possible. I'm not offering you the position, I'm offering you an interview. A chance to prove you are qualified. If you get the job, it's because you earned it, not because I felt sorry for you." Becca was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on Sophie's distant figure. When she spoke, her voice was steady but soft. "Why me? You must know dozens of people who would want that job. People with experience, with references, with resumes that don't have a 3-year gap for stayed home with child and then worked at a laundromat under the table. Because I've seen how you handle Sophie," Daniel said. "You're organized. I've watched you pack a bag for the park that has everything she could possibly need. You're responsible. You show up here at the same time every day, rain or shine. You're intelligent, the way you read people, the way you assess situations before you act tells me you're paying attention in ways most people don't. And you're honest, brutally, sometimes painfully honest. Those are the qualities I value in an employee. The technical skills can be learned. What if it doesn't work out? Becca asked. What if I'm terrible at the job and you have to fire me? Or what if I'm great at it and then you decide you want something in return? If you're terrible at the job, I'll fire you. That's business. I'll give you a fair severance and help you find something else if I can, but the employment ends. As for the other thing, Daniel paused, choosing his words with care. I'm not Victor. I don't want anything from you except honest work. The contract will spell out exactly what you're being paid to do, and that's all I'll ever ask. If I ever step out of line, if I ever make you feel unsafe or pressured or obligated in ways that aren't professional, you can walk away. No questions, no retaliation, no damage to your reputation. I'll put that in writing if you want. Becca turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for deception. You'd really put that in a contract? Whatever you need to feel safe. This isn't about me feeling good about myself. It's about giving you a genuine opportunity to build something better. Henry did that for me 20 years ago, and I've been looking for ways to pay it forward ever since. But I'm not going to pretend my motives are entirely selfless. The truth is I need someone good, and I think you could be great. This is as much about what you can do for my company as what I can do for you. Sophie had emerged from the woods carrying a particularly impressive stick, which she was now using to draw patterns in the dirt near the duck pond. Becca watched her for a moment, and Daniel could see the war playing out behind her eyes. Fear versus hope. Safety versus opportunity. The known misery of her current life versus the unknown risks of trusting again. I need to think about it, she finally said. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. Same time, same bench. When you're ready to talk, I'll be ready to listen. She nodded, then stood and called for Sophie. As she walked away, she paused and looked back at Daniel one more time. Daniel, she said quietly, thank you, not for the offer, for understanding why I need time. I understand better than you know, he replied. And Becca, whatever you decide, I'm glad I met you. She didn't respond, but something in her expression softened. Then she turned and walked away. Sophie's hand in hers disappearing into the golden autumn light. 4 days passed. Daniel came to the park every afternoon, sat on his usual bench, and waited. Becca did not appear. He told himself it was fine that she was thinking that she needed space to make a decision this important. But part of him worried that he had pushed too hard too fast, that she had decided he was just another Victor in different clothing and had cut her losses while she still could. On the 5th day, his office phone rang. Margaret put the call through with a knowing look that suggested she had figured out exactly who was on the other end. Mr. Harrison. The voice was formal, careful, the voice of someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say. This is Rebecca Moore. We met at the park. I'd like to schedule an interview for the administrative position if it's still available. Daniel smiled, the tension of the past 4 days dissolving into relief. It's still available. When would work for you? I have a sitter arranged for Monday morning if that's not too short notice. Monday morning is perfect. 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock, Becca confirmed. And Mr. Harrison, Daniel, I'm still not sure I trust you, but I'm willing to try now. That's all I'm asking, Daniel said. See you Monday, Becca. He hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the quiet of his office, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. This was how it had started with Henry, a single chance, an open door, an opportunity that could change everything. He remembered standing in the diner doorway with baby Grace in his arms, terrified and hopeful and desperate for someone to see him as more than his circumstances. Henry had seen him, had seen past the poverty and the grief and the barely controlled panic to the person beneath, had offered not charity but dignity, not pity, but possibility. Now it was Daniel's turn to see someone else, to offer the same gift he had been given, the gift that had changed the trajectory of his life. He did not know if Becca would accept it. He did not know if she would succeed, but he knew he had to try. Not for his own sake, not to feel good about himself, but because that was what Henry would have done. Because that was what the world needed. People who saw suffering and responded with opportunity, instead of pity, with dignity, instead of judgment, with the kind of help that lifted up without pushing down. The photograph on his desk caught his eye, the same photograph from his study, younger Daniel and Henry standing in front of the diner. Henry's hand on his shoulder, both of them smiling. "I'm trying, Henry," Daniel said softly to the empty office. "I'm trying to be the kind of person you taught me to be." The photograph, of course, did not answer, but Daniel felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the heating system, and he knew with a certainty that went beyond logic that Henry would have approved. Monday arrived with the crisp clarity of early October mornings. Daniel had asked Margaret to clear his schedule between 9:30 and noon, providing ample time for the interview without making Becca feel rushed. He had also given Margaret a brief overview of the situation, enough for her to understand the stakes, not enough to betray Becca's confidence. Margaret, ever perceptive, had listened without interruption and then nodded once. "I'll make sure she feels welcome," she said, "and I'll reserve judgment until I see what she can do. Fair." "More than fair. Thank you, Margaret." "Don't thank me yet. If she's terrible, I'm going to say so. I won't let sentiment compromise this company." "I wouldn't expect anything less." Becca arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a carefully pressed blouse and slacks that looked like they might have been purchased recently at a thrift store. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her makeup was subtle but professional. She carried a thin folder that probably contained her resume printed on slightly yellowed paper, the paper of someone who couldn't afford new supplies, but who was doing her best with what she had. Margaret greeted her in the reception area with professional warmth, offering coffee and directing her to a comfortable chair, while Daniel finished his morning preparations. From his office, he could hear their voices through the partially open door, Margaret asking about the commute, commenting on the weather, making small talk that put nervous interviewees at ease. Becca's responses were quiet but steady, the voice of someone determined to make a good impression, despite the fear that must be churning beneath the surface. At precisely 10 o'clock, Daniel emerged from his office and extended his hand. "Rebecca, thank you for coming. Please come in and have a seat." She took his hand, her grip firm, despite the slight tremor he could feel beneath her skin. Her eyes swept the office quickly, taking in the bookshelves, the awards, the photograph of him and Henry sitting on the corner of his desk. Her gaze lingered on that last one for just a moment before she turned her attention back to Daniel. "Thank you for the opportunity," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I know my background isn't exactly conventional." "Conventional is overrated," Daniel replied, taking his own seat. "Tell me about yourself. Not the resume version, the real version. What do you want out of life? What drives you?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She had prepared for standard interview questions, strengths, weaknesses, 5-year plans, but not for this. Daniel watched as she recalibrated, setting aside her rehearsed answers in favor of something more authentic. "I want my daughter to have a better life than I did," she said slowly. "I want her to go to school without worrying about whether there will be dinner when she gets home. I want her to feel safe, to believe that the world isn't just a series of traps waiting to spring. And I want to be able to provide that for her through my own work, not through dependence on anyone else. That's what drives me." "That's a powerful motivation," Daniel said. "And what makes you think you'd be good at this particular job?" Becca straightened in her chair, the uncertainty in her eyes giving way to something harder. "Because I've spent the last 2 years learning how to survive on almost nothing. I know how to prioritize, how to organize, how to make every resource stretch as far as it can go. I know how to read people, how to anticipate problems before they happen, how to stay calm when everything around me is falling apart. And I know how to work harder than most people can imagine, because I don't have the luxury of half measures. Every day is a test I can't afford to fail." Daniel nodded, impressed despite himself. He had expected competence, the kind of learned skill that comes from dealing with difficult circumstances. What he found was something rare, genuine capacity waiting for the chance to bloom. "Tell me about your experience with computers," he said, moving into more practical territory. "Basic word processing, email, internet research. Nothing fancy, but I learn fast. Whatever you need me to know, I can learn. Scheduling and calendar management. I've been managing Sophie's appointments, Dr. Dentist, school events, alongside my work shifts and our household logistics. It's not the same as corporate scheduling, but the principles are similar. Customer interaction. How do you handle difficult people?" A ghost of a smile crossed Becca's face. "With patience and boundaries. I listen to what they need, I explain what I can and can't do, and I don't let them push me past what's reasonable. Sophie's father taught me that lesson the hard way. Some people will take everything you give and still want more. The trick is knowing where to draw the line. The interview continued for another 45 minutes, covering everything from filing systems to phone etiquette to handling confidential information. Becca answered each question thoughtfully, acknowledging her lack of formal experience while emphasizing her willingness to learn. By the end, Daniel had confirmed what he suspected from the beginning. She was more than qualified. She was exceptional. I want to be direct with you, he said as the interview wound down. This is a real job with real expectations. I don't give second chances for substandard work. If you're not performing after 90 days, you're gone. But if you are performing, and I think you will be, you'll have a permanent position with benefits and room for growth. Does that sound fair? Becca met his eyes steadily. It sounds more than fair. It sounds like what I've been looking for. Then the job is yours if you want it. Standard probationary period, starting wage of $18 an hour, benefits kick in after 3 months. The contract will spell out everything in writing, including the provisions we discussed. Take it home, read it carefully, have someone else look it over if you can. We'll start next Monday. For a moment, Becca's composure slipped. Her eyes glistened with tears. She quickly blinked away, and her hands gripped the arms of her chair with white-knuckled intensity. She was struggling to believe this was real, Daniel knew. Part of her was still tetting for the catch, the hidden price, the betrayal that would prove her fears justified. I don't know what to say, she finally managed. I wasn't expecting. You don't have to say anything except yes or no. Take the contract. Think about it. Call me when you've decided. No pressure, no expectations. She stood accepting the folder he extended across the desk. Yes, she said quietly. I don't need to think about it. Yes, I'll be here Monday. Daniel stood as well, extending his hand once more. Then I'll see you Monday. Welcome to Harrison Consulting, Rebecca. She took his hand, and this time her grip was steady. Thank you, she said. Not for charity, but for the chance to earn it. That's exactly how I wanted it to feel. Margaret was waiting in the reception area when Becca emerged, and Daniel saw the older woman's sharp eyes assessing, evaluating, reserving judgment. Becca thanked her for the coffee and headed toward the elevator, the contract folder pressed against her chest like a shield. When she was gone, Margaret turned to Daniel with an expression that was hard to read. She's hiding something, she said flatly. Something that scares her. You know that, right? I know. And you hired her anyway. I did. Margaret was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. Henry would have done the same thing. It was the highest compliment she could offer, and Daniel felt the weight of it settle around his shoulders like a mantle. He was not. Henry could never be Henry, but perhaps in this moment he was close enough. Let's see how the first week goes, he said. Give her the benefit of the doubt until she gives you a reason not to. I always do, Margaret replied, but I'm watching. I'm always watching. Daniel returned to his office, but he found it difficult to focus on work. His mind kept returning to the interview, to the way Becca's face had transformed when she realized the offer was genuine. Fear giving way to hope. Suspicion yielding to possibility. The first fragile shoots of trust pushing through the hard soil of experience. He did not know if this would work. He did not know if Becca would succeed, or if the demons of her past would catch up with her, or if Victor Crane would somehow reappear to destroy everything she was trying to build. But he knew that he had done what Henry would have wanted. He had opened a door. Now it was up to Becca to walk through it. The photograph on his desk seemed to catch the light differently as the afternoon sun shifted. Daniel picked it up, running his thumb over the glass that covered Henry's smiling face. One day at a time, he said softly. That's what you always told me. One day at a time, one good deed at a time, one life at a time. That's how we change the world. The photograph as always offered no response, but Daniel felt peace settling over him, the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. Whatever happened next, he had done the right thing. Henry would have been proud. And that in the end was all that mattered. Becca started the following Monday, arriving 30 minutes early with a nervous energy that Margaret surprisingly seemed to find endearing rather than irritating. Daniel gave her a tour of the office, introduced her to the small team, Tom Bradley, who handled the financial side of the business, 2 junior consultants named Alicia and James, and Margaret, who ran everything else, and then left her in Margaret's capable hands for training. For the first few days, Becca was a shadow, quiet and watchful, absorbing information like a sponge. She asked thoughtful questions, took copious notes, and never made the same mistake twice. By the end of the first week, she was handling routine correspondence with minimal supervision. By the end of the second week, she had reorganized the filing system in ways that even Margaret admitted were improvements. By the end of the third week, she had become indispensable. Daniel watched her transformation with quiet satisfaction. The hunched shoulders and downcast eyes of those early park encounters were gradually giving way to a new posture, straighter, more confident, the posture of someone beginning to believe in her own competence. She still kept her distance from personal conversations, still flinched at unexpected touches, still scanned every room for exits when she entered. But the fear that had radiated from her like heat from a fire was slowly dimming, replaced by something that looked like cautious hope. The true test came 6 weeks into her employment on a bitterly cold November evening when Daniel was working late on a proposal. His phone rang, and when he answered, Becca's voice came through the line tight with barely controlled panic. "Mr. Harrison, Daniel, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I don't know who else to call." The formality of Mr. Harrison slipping into his first name told him more than her words. Something was very wrong. "What is it? What's happened?" "It's Sophie." Becca's voice cracked on her daughter's name. "She's sick, really sick. High fever, trouble breathing. I need to take her to the emergency room, but I don't have anyone to watch her tomorrow while I work, and I know I just started, and I shouldn't be asking for time off, but—" "Becca," Daniel cut through her spiraling panic with a firm but gentle voice. "Stop. Take a breath. Where are you now?" "At the motel. She's in the bed. She's burning up. I don't know what to do." "Which hospital are you going to, Ma?" "County General. It's the closest." "Go, right now. Don't worry about work. Don't worry about tomorrow. Don't worry about anything except getting Sophie the care she needs. I'll meet you there." There was a moment of stunned silence. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to. Now go. I'll see you soon." He hung up before she could protest further and grabbed his coat, already moving toward the door. The drive to County General took 20 minutes in evening traffic, 20 minutes during which Daniel's mind churned with memories he usually kept locked away. He remembered hospital waiting rooms from his own past, the fluorescent lights, the antiseptic smell, the terrible helplessness of watching his daughter struggle to breathe while doctors did things he could not understand. Grace had been hospitalized twice in her first year of life, once for a respiratory infection and once for a fall that had caused a concussion. Both times Daniel had sat alone in plastic chairs counting the tiles on the floor and praying to a God he was not sure he believed in. He found them in the pediatric emergency department, Becca sitting on a hard plastic chair with Sophie limp in her arms. The little girl's face was flushed with fever, her breathing labored, her golden curls dark with sweat. Becca looked up as Daniel approached, and the relief in her eyes was so raw, so naked that it made his chest ache. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "You didn't have to—" "Stop saying that." Daniel sat down beside her, close enough to offer support, but not so close as to invade her space. "How is she?" "They think it's pneumonia. They want to admit her run tests start antibiotics." Becca's voice broke. "I don't have insurance. I don't know how I'm going to pay for this." "We'll figure that out later. Right now, the only thing that matters is getting Sophie well." A nurse appeared and called Sophie's name. Becca stood adjusting her daughter's weight in her arms, and Daniel rose with her. "Do you want me to come back with you, or would you rather I wait here?" Becca hesitated, the old fear warring with the new need. Then she nodded slowly. "Come, please. I don't want to do this alone." They followed the nurse through swinging doors into the treatment area where a pediatrician was waiting with a stethoscope and a gentle smile. Daniel hung back while Becca settled Sophie onto an examination table, watching as the doctor listened to the child's lungs and checked her vitals. The diagnosis was confirmed quickly. Pneumonia caught early enough to treat, but serious enough to require hospitalization. Sophie was admitted to the pediatric ward, where IV antibiotics and supplemental oxygen would give her body the support it needed to heal. The hours that followed blurred together in the way hospital hours always do. Becca sat by Sophie's bedside, holding her daughter's small hand, murmuring reassurances even after Sophie had fallen into a restless, fever-troubled sleep. Daniel stayed nearby, fetching coffee and sandwiches from the cafeteria, making phone calls to rearrange his schedule for the next few days, simply being present in the way that Henry had taught him presence mattered. Sometime after midnight, when Sophie's fever had finally begun to respond to the antibiotics and her breathing had eased into a steadier rhythm, Becca looked up at Daniel with red-rimmed eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really, why I'm nobody to you, a struggling woman with a sick kid. You have no reason to be here." Daniel considered the question carefully. He could have given her platitudes about kindness and compassion, but she deserved better than that. She deserved the truth. "Because I know what it feels like to sit in a hospital alone with a sick child, terrified that you can't afford the care they need, terrified that you'll lose the one thing that matters more than your own life. I sat in rooms just like this one with Grace when she was a baby, counting coins in my pocket, and wondering if I was going to have to choose between her health and our survival. And every time I was alone, there was no one to bring me coffee or sit with me through the long hours, no one to tell me it was going to be okay. I won't let anyone else go through that alone if I can help it." Becca's eyes filled with tears that she did not try to hide. "But the bill, the hospital bill, you said we'd figure it out later, but there is no figuring it out. I don't have the money. I won't have the money. They're going to send collectors after me, ruin whatever credit I've managed to rebuild." "Becca." Daniel leaned forward, holding her gaze with steady intensity. "I'm going to pay Sophie's hospital bill. Directly to the hospital so you never see the numbers. And before you say no, before you tell me you can't accept that, I want you to understand something. This is not charity. This is not a favor that creates an obligation. This is me doing what Henry did for me 20 years ago when my daughter was sick and I couldn't afford the care she needed. He paid my rent for 3 months without telling me until after the fact. He wouldn't let me pay him back. He said the same thing I'm saying now. This is not a transaction. This is just basic human decency. But I don't want anything from you, Becca. Not gratitude, not loyalty, nothing. You don't owe me for this. You will never owe me for this. If you want to pay it forward someday, when you're in a position to help someone else who's struggling, then do that. But you don't owe me anything except to keep being the kind of mother who would do anything for her daughter. That's it. That's all." Becca was silent for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I don't know how to accept this. I don't know how to not feel like I owe you everything." "Then don't accept it for yourself," Daniel said gently. "Accept it for Sophie, because she shouldn't suffer because her mother is afraid of being hurt again. She deserves care, and you deserve not to destroy yourself trying to provide it alone." Sophie stirred in her hospital bed, coughing weakly. Becca turned to her, immediately stroking her daughter's hair, murmuring soft reassurances. And in that moment, watching her love for her child overcome her fear of obligation, Daniel knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. The walls were not completely down. They might never be completely down. But there were doors in them now, and Becca was beginning to let people through. Sophie recovered quickly, as children often do. After 3 days in the hospital, she was discharged with a bottle of antibiotics and instructions for follow-up care. Daniel drove them home, not to the motel, but to a modest apartment he had quietly arranged for them during Sophie's hospitalization. He presented it as a benefit of Becca's employment, a housing allowance that was technically part of her compensation package, framed in a way that allowed her to accept without feeling like a charity case. Becca cried when she saw the 2-bedroom unit, the smaller kitchen, the window that looked out onto a quiet street. Sophie ran from room to room, claiming spaces, imagining a life that had seemed impossible just weeks before. And Daniel stood in the doorway, watching them, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept. "I don't know how to thank you," Becca said, when Sophie had finally exhausted herself exploring. "You thank me by taking care of your daughter," Daniel replied, "by showing up for work and doing your job well, by building a life worth living. That's all the thanks I need." She nodded slowly, still struggling to believe any of this was real. But there was something new in her eyes now, not trust, not quite, but the first fragile beginnings of it. The seed of belief that maybe, just maybe, the world was not as cruel as she had learned to expect. Daniel said goodbye and drove home through the November darkness, his mind full of thoughts he did not try to organize. He was thinking of Henry. Of course, always Henry the ghost, who guided his footsteps even now. But he was also thinking of Becca, of the journey she had begun, of the person she was becoming, as the fear slowly loosened its grip on her heart. He did not know what the future held. He did not know if the scars of her past would ever fully heal, or if Victor Crane would somehow reappear to threaten the life she was building. But he knew that he had done what he could. He had opened doors. He had offered opportunity without obligation. He had shown her that kindness without cost was possible, even if she had spent years learning the opposite lesson. And now it was up to her to walk through the doors, to accept the opportunities, to build something worth having. That was how the world changed, Daniel thought as he pulled into his driveway. One person at a time, one act of kindness at a time. One door opened, one life transformed, one ripple spreading outward through the darkness. Henry had started the ripple 20 years ago when he hired a desperate young father to wash dishes in his restaurant. Daniel had continued it, helping Becca when she needed it most. And someday perhaps Becca would continue it too, helping someone else who stood where she had stood, offering the same gift she had received. That was the legacy worth leaving. Not money, not achievements, not the hollow trophies of success. Just one human being recognizing another's struggle and choosing to help. Just one ripple spreading ever outward until the whole world was touched by its gentle waves. The weeks following Sophie's hospitalization marked a transformation that unfolded slowly like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Becca arrived at the office each morning with a steadiness that had been absent in those early days. Her posture straighter, her voice more confident when she answered phones or greeted clients. She had stopped flinching at sudden movements, stopped scanning rooms for exits, stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. The apartment Daniel had arranged became a home, decorated with Sophie's crayon drawings and thrift store finds that Becca selected with an eye for beauty that surprised him. She was building a life piece by careful piece, and watching her do it filled Daniel with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with his own generosity. Margaret, ever the skeptic, had gradually warmed to Becca as well. The older woman's initial wariness had given way to something like respect earned through Becca's meticulous attention to detail and her willingness to learn. They developed a rhythm in the office, Margaret handling the high-level administrative decisions, while Becca managed the day-to-day logistics with quiet efficiency. Tom Bradley, who had initially questioned the wisdom of hiring someone with such an unconventional background, now routinely praised Becca's organizational skills in staff meetings. She had become, in the span of 2 months, an integral part of Harrison Consulting Group. The change in Sophie was equally remarkable. The little girl who had once stared at other children's plates with hungry eyes now attended a proper preschool program, made friends, and chattered endlessly about her teachers and classmates. She had gained weight, her cheeks filling out with the healthy roundness of well-fed childhood, and her tangled blonde curls were now brushed smooth each morning by a mother who finally had time for such things. Grace had become Sophie's favorite person in the world, after Becca and the two girls spent Saturday afternoons at Daniel's house, playing elaborate games of make-believe while their parents watched from the porch. Daniel found himself looking forward to those Saturdays more than he cared to admit. There was something healing about watching the two families merge into something like an extended unit bound not by blood, but by circumstance and choice. Becca had begun to relax around him, allowing herself to laugh at his jokes and share small details about her day without the constant undertone of wariness. They were not quite friends. The employer-employee boundary remained carefully maintained, but they were something more than acquaintances. Fellow travelers, perhaps. Two people who had walked similar paths and found each other along the way. It was on a Thursday afternoon in early December that the fragile peace began to crack. Daniel was in his office reviewing quarterly projections with Tom when he heard the commotion in the reception area. Raised voices, one of them male and unfamiliar, the other Margaret's unmistakable tone of cold authority. He excused himself and stepped out to find a man standing at the reception desk, his expensive suit and polished shoes marking him as someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. He was perhaps 45, with salt and pepper hair, styled with careful precision, and features that might have been handsome, if not for the cruel set of his mouth. But it was Becca who captured Daniel's attention. She was standing behind Margaret's desk, her face drained of color, her body rigid with a fear so visceral it seemed to radiate from her like heat. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk with white-knuckled intensity, and her eyes were fixed on the stranger with an expression Daniel recognized from their earliest encounters. This was the look of prey confronted by a predator, the ancient animal terror of being hunted. The stranger turned at Daniel's approach, and his smile was the smile of a man who believed himself in complete control of every situation. You must be Daniel Harrison. I've heard a lot about you. Victor Crane. He extended his hand with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime making powerful first impressions. Daniel did not take the offered hand. The name had hit him like a physical blow, connecting instantly with everything Becca had told him in the park that autumn afternoon. Victor Crane, the man who had exploited her desperation, destroyed her reputation, driven her to the edge of homelessness. The man who had taught her that kindness was just another word for leverage. I know who you are, Daniel said, his voice flat and cold. What do you want? Victor's smile did not waver, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps at being recognized. I'm here to speak with Rebecca. We have unfinished business, she and I, personal matters that don't concern you. Everything that happens in this office concerns me, and Rebecca is my employee, which means her well-being is my responsibility. Her well-being. Victor's laugh was soft and condescending. Is that what you call it? I've seen this movie before, Harrison. Rich man plays savior to desperate woman, expects gratitude in return. The details vary, but the plot is always the same. Daniel felt anger building in his chest, hot and tight, but he kept his voice steady. You're projecting. Not everyone operates the way you do. Everyone operates the way I do. Some are just better at hiding it. Victor turned his attention back to Becca, who had not moved or spoken since Daniel entered the room. Rebecca, sweetheart, we need to talk. Privately, I'm sure your new employer won't mind giving us a few minutes. Becca's voice emerged thin and strained, barely audible. I have nothing to say to you. That's unfortunate because I have plenty to say to you about the money you owe me, about the damage you did to my reputation with your lies, about what happens to people who make accusations they can't prove. She doesn't owe you anything, Daniel cut in, and if you're here to threaten her, you can leave now, or I'll call the police. Victor's smile turned sharp. Threaten? I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply having a conversation with an old friend. Isn't that right, Rebecca? We were never friends. Becca's voice was stronger now, bolstered by Daniel's presence. You were my employer, and you tried to make me into something else. When I refused, you destroyed my life. I gave you opportunities. Victor said, his tone shifting to wounded innocence. I helped you when no one else would. And how did you repay me? With accusations, with ingratitude, with lies that could have ruined me if anyone had believed them. They weren't lies. Prove it. Victor stepped closer to the reception desk, and Becca instinctively stepped back. That's the problem, isn't it? You have no proof, just your word against mine. And who do you think people believe, a respected businessman with a track record of success or a desperate single mother who couldn't hold down a job? Daniel moved to position himself between Victor and the reception desk, his body a physical barrier between the predator and his prey. This conversation is over. Leave now or I'm calling security. Victor regarded him with cool amusement. You're making a mistake, Harrison. This woman is not what she seems. She's a manipulator, a liar, someone who uses her sob story to extract favors from gullible men. Ask her about the other employers she's burned. Ask her about the trail of destruction she's left behind. I don't need to ask her anything. I know who she is, and I know who you are. Do you? Victor's smile widened. Do you really? Because I know who you are too. Daniel Harrison, founder of Harrison Consulting Group, former protege of Henry Callahan. God rest his soul. Impressive rise from humble beginnings, very inspiring story. But I've done my research. I know about the early years, the struggles, the desperation. I know how far you'd go to protect something you've built from nothing. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Is that supposed to intimidate me? It's supposed to inform you. Rebecca is not worth risking everything you have built. Let me take care of our unfinished business, and you can go back to your life without any complications. Get out. Harrison, I said get out. Daniel's voice carried the full weight of 20 years of fighting his way up from nothing, of learning to stand his ground against people who tried to push him down. If you come back here, if you contact Rebecca outside this office, if you do anything to interfere with her life or her livelihood, I will destroy you. I have resources you can't imagine and connections you don't know about. Don't test me. For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across Victor's face. He was not accustomed to being challenged, Daniel realized. His power came from intimidation, from targeting people who were too vulnerable to fight back. Confronted with someone who refused to be intimidated, he was unsure how to proceed. "This isn't over," Victor said finally, his voice low and hard. "Rebecca knows what she owes me, and sooner or later she's going to pay." He turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps sharp against the polished floor. The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Margaret was the first to move, crossing to where Becca stood frozen behind the desk. "Sit down before you fall down," she said, her voice gruff but gentle. "I'll get you some water." Becca sank into a chair, her whole body trembling. Daniel crouched beside her, careful not to touch her without permission, his voice soft. "He's gone. You're safe. He can't hurt you here." "He found me." Becca's voice was barely a whisper. "I changed my name, moved to a new city, started over from nothing. And he still found me." "How did he find you?" Daniel asked. "Did he say?" "He always finds people. That's what he does. He has investigators, lawyers, people who track down anyone who crosses him." Her eyes met Daniel's, and the fear in them was bottomless. "I should leave. Before he does to you what he did to everyone else who tried to help me." "You're not leaving," Daniel's voice was firm. "Running didn't work before, and it won't work now. The only way to deal with someone like Victor is to stand your ground and fight." "Fight?" Becca laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Fight with what? He has money, power, connections. I have nothing." "You have us," Margaret said, returning with a glass of water. "You have this office, these people, whatever resources we can bring to bear. And you have something Victor doesn't have, the truth." Becca looked at Margaret with surprise. The older woman was not given to displays of loyalty or emotion, and her declaration of support seemed to catch Becca off guard. "Why would you help me?" Becca asked. "You barely know me, and you've seen what happens to people who get in Victor's way." Margaret's expression softened in a way Daniel had rarely seen. "Because I was you once, 30 years ago, before I learned to fight back. Different man, same tactics. He used my desperation against me, tried to take things I wasn't willing to give. I let him drive me away from a career I loved, let him make me believe I was worthless, let him win because I didn't know I had any other choice." She sat down heavily in the chair next to Becca, her age showing in a way it rarely did. "I spent years rebuilding from that. Years learning that men like him only have power over us if we give it to them. And I swore that if I ever saw someone else going through what I went through, I wouldn't stand by and watch. So no, I'm not going to let you run. Not when there's a chance to make this right." Daniel felt something shift in the air of the office, a new alignment forming. They were not just employer and employees anymore. They were allies united against a common enemy bound by shared experience and shared purpose. "We need to know everything," Daniel said gently. "Everything about your history with Victor, everything he might use against you, everything he's done that we might be able to prove. If we're going to fight him, we need to know what we're fighting." Becca nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'll tell you everything, but I need to do something first." "What?" "I need to pick up Sophie from school. I need to hold my daughter and remind myself what I'm fighting for." Daniel straightened and reached for his keys. "I'll drive you. Margaret, can you hold down the fort?" "Always do," Margaret replied. "And Daniel, when you get back, we need to talk. There are some things about Victor Crane that you should know, things that might change how we approach this." Daniel paused at the door, sensing the weight behind Margaret's words. "What kind of things?" "The kind that explain why he's here, why he's really here. It's not just about Rebecca. There's more to this story than she knows." The drive to Sophie's school was quiet, Becca lost in thoughts she did not share, and Daniel focused on the road ahead. They arrived as the final bell rang, joining the queue of parents waiting at the pickup line. When Sophie emerged from the building, her face lit up at the sight of her mother, and she ran across the sidewalk with arms outstretched. Becca caught her and held her tight, burying her face in Sophie's hair, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Sophie, with the intuition of children who have learned to read adult emotions, did not ask what was wrong. She simply hugged her mother back and waited for the storm to pass. Daniel watched them from a few feet away, giving them space while remaining close enough to offer protection if needed. The sight of Becca's fierce embrace reminded him of his own moments of desperate gratitude, of holding baby Grace and thanking whatever power might be listening that she was safe, that she was healthy, that she was his. When Becca finally released Sophie, she knelt to look her daughter in the eye. Everything is okay, baby. Mommy just had a hard day at work, but we're going to be fine. We're going to be better than fine. Can we get ice cream? Sophie asked with the practical optimism of childhood. Becca laughed through her tears. Yes, we can definitely get ice cream. They stopped at a small shop on the way back to the office, and Daniel waited in the car while Becca and Sophie went inside. Through the window, he could see them at the counter, Sophie pointing excitedly at flavors, while Becca smiled with a warmth that had been absent since Victor's appearance. The resilience of that woman never ceased to amaze him. She had been knocked down again and again, and every time she had gotten back up. Not because she did not feel the blows, but because she refused to let them define her. His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Come back soon. Found something important. Victor Crane has history with Harrison Consulting. Not directly, but close. Daniel read the message twice, trying to parse its meaning. History with Harrison Consulting. That was impossible. He had never heard of Victor Crane before Becca's story in the park. Unless Margaret meant something else, something he did not yet understand. He typed back a quick reply. On my way, 30 minutes. When Becca and Sophie emerged from the ice cream shop, their moods visibly lighter. Daniel made a decision. I'm going to drop you both at your apartment, he said as they got back in the car. Margaret needs me at the office for something urgent, but I want you to lock the doors and stay inside until I call you. Can you do that? Becca's expression shifted back to wariness. What is it? What happened? I don't know yet, but Margaret found something about Victor, something she says I need to see. I'll call you as soon as I know more. She nodded, accepting his caution without argument. Be careful. Victor doesn't play fair. Neither do I, not when it matters. He drove them home and waited until they were safely inside before heading back to the office. The late afternoon light was fading toward evening, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now it just felt ominous, the dying light of a day that had brought nothing but trouble. Margaret was waiting for him in the conference room, a laptop open in front of her, and a stack of printed documents beside it. Her face was grave, the playful sharpness she usually wore replaced by something harder. Close the door, she said. You're going to want privacy for this. Daniel did as she asked and sat across from her, bracing himself. What did you find? Victor Crane, Margaret began, is not just some random predator who happened to target Rebecca. He's been on my radar for years, ever since he tried to acquire a property Henry Callahan owned back in the early 2000s. The deal fell through because Henry refused to sell. Victor didn't take that well. Henry knew Victor. Daniel felt the ground shifting beneath him. They had dealings, contentious ones. Victor wanted to buy the building where the restaurant was located, tear it down, build something more profitable. Henry said no. Victor offered more money, made threats, tried every trick in the book. Henry still said no. Eventually, Victor moved on to other projects, but according to the notes Henry left behind, he never forgot the slight. Margaret pushed a folder across the table. Inside were photocopied documents, letters, legal correspondence. Daniel leafed through them, his confusion deepening with each page. What does this have to do with Rebecca? He asked. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Victor Crane is a man who keeps grudges. He collects them like other people collect coins. Henry humiliated him 20 years ago, and Victor has been waiting for a chance to return the favor. Henry's gone now, but you're his legacy. You inherited his values, his mission, his approach to the world. And now you've hired someone Victor considers his property, someone who escaped him and started over. Don't you think that's quite a coincidence? Daniel felt cold understanding settling in his gut. You think he targeted Rebecca because of me? I think he might have nudged her in your direction, Shell. Think about it. She shows up at the same restaurant Henry founded, the same restaurant where you eat every Saturday with your daughter. She catches your attention, you decide to help her, and suddenly you're drawn into a conflict with a man who has been waiting decades for a chance to hurt someone connected to Henry Callahan. That's insane. That would mean Victor has been playing a very long game, Margaret finished, and we've been playing right into his hands. Daniel stared at the documents without seeing them, his mind racing. If Margaret was right, then everything he thought he knew about his encounter with Becca was wrong. Not the emotions, those were real, but the circumstances. The coincidence of meeting her at Henry's restaurant, the way she had appeared at exactly the moment when Daniel was vulnerable to helping someone in need, the trail of events that had led them to this moment. "Does Rebecca know?" he asked quietly. "I don't think so. I don't think she has any idea Victor's interest in her has anything to do with you or Henry. To her, he's just the man who tried to exploit her. She doesn't know about the larger game. We have to tell her." "Agreed, but carefully. This information could break what little trust she's managed to build. If she thinks she was used as a pawn, if she thinks her entire relationship with you is based on manipulation, she might run. And running is exactly what Victor wants." Daniel rubbed his temples, trying to process the implications. He had believed he was helping someone in need following Henry's example, paying forward the kindness that had saved his own life. But if Margaret was right, then Victor had been pulling the strings from the beginning, orchestrating events to draw Daniel into a conflict he did not choose. But did it matter? Did the origin of their meeting change anything about who Rebecca was, what she needed, what Daniel had felt compelled to offer? He thought of Sophie's laugh, of Becca's gradual transformation from fearful survivor to confident employee of the community that had formed around them in the months since that first encounter. Those things were real. Victor could not take them away, no matter what game he had been playing. "We proceed as planned," Daniel said finally. "We fight Victor with everything we have, but we do it with full honesty. Rebecca deserves to know the truth, even if it's painful. She spent too much of her life being kept in the dark." Margaret nodded slowly. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's one more thing." "What?" "Henry left a letter, sealed, addressed to you to be opened when Victor Crane comes calling. I found it in his files when I was researching today. I don't know how he knew this day would come, but he knew, and he left you instructions." She pulled an envelope from beneath the stack of documents. It was yellowed with age, the handwriting on the front unmistakably Henry's. Daniel took it with trembling hands, feeling the weight of a message from beyond the grave. "Open it," Margaret said gently. "Whatever it says, you need to know." Daniel broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Henry's voice seemed to rise from the page, warm and wise, and utterly missed. "Daniel," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then Victor Crane has finally made his move. I always knew he would. Men like him don't forget, and they don't forgive. They wait, and they scheme, and they strike when they think you're weakest. But here's what Victor never understood. Strength isn't about power or money or connections. Strength is about knowing who you are and refusing to compromise that identity no matter what pressure you face. You have that strength, Daniel. I saw it in you from the first day you walked into my restaurant with that beautiful baby girl, desperate and terrified, but still standing, still fighting, still refusing to give up. Whatever Victor throws at you, remember that you've already survived worse. You've already proven that you can build something beautiful from nothing. Don't let him take that from you. And don't let him take whatever good you've done in the years since we met. The people you've helped, the lives you've touched, those are your legacy, not your vulnerability. Protect them, fight for them, and never apologize for being the kind of person who gives a damn. I believe in you. I always have. Now go show Victor what happens when he picks a fight with someone who was forged in fire. With all my love, Henry. Daniel read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, but his jaw was set with determination. We're going to win this, he said quietly. For Henry, for Rebecca, for everyone Victor has ever tried to destroy. Margaret smiled, the first real smile she had shown all day. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. The days that followed Victor's appearance at the office felt like the quiet before a storm, that eerie stillness when the air grows heavy and the sky darkens, but the rain has not yet begun to fall. Daniel threw himself into preparation, working with Margaret to compile every piece of information they could find about Victor Crane's business dealings, his legal history, his pattern of targeting vulnerable women. Tom Bradley, once skeptical of Becca's presence in the company, proved an unexpected ally, using his financial connections to trace the flow of money through Victor's various enterprises and uncovering irregularities that suggested fraud on a significant scale. Becca worked alongside them with a determination that bordered on ferocity. The fear that had paralyzed her in the reception area had transformed into something harder, something that burned like cold fire behind her eyes. She provided names of other women Victor had targeted, contacts she had maintained in secret during her years of hiding, women who had been too afraid to speak out, but who might be willing to add their voices to a chorus of accusation. One by one, Margaret reached out to them, building a network of survivors who had never known they were not alone. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret had been digging through Henry's old files, searching for any additional documentation of his dealings with Victor, when she discovered a safety deposit box key taped to the back of a folder. The box, located at a bank downtown, contained a small fortune. In documents, contracts, Victor had violated, recordings of conversations that revealed his true intentions, photographs of properties he had acquired through intimidation and fraud. Henry, it seemed, had been building a case against Victor for years, quietly gathering evidence while publicly maintaining distance from the man who had tried to destroy him. Daniel sat in his office late one evening, spreading the documents across his desk like pieces of a puzzle that was finally coming together. The scope of Victor's corruption was staggering. He had defrauded investors, manipulated zoning boards, destroyed competitors through illegal means, and left a trail of ruined lives in his wake. The women he had exploited were just one part of a larger pattern of predation that touched every aspect of his business empire. Margaret knocked on the open door, her face grave. "There's something else you need to see. I've been cross-referencing the names of Victor's victims with public records, and I found something disturbing." She handed him a printout, and Daniel felt the blood drain from his face as he read. 3 of the women Victor had targeted over the years had died under circumstances that were officially ruled accidents or suicides. One had driven her car off a bridge 6 months after refusing to testify against him in a civil suit. Another had overdosed on prescription medication shortly after he threatened to take her children. A third had fallen from the balcony of her apartment the week she was scheduled to meet with investigators. "He's not just a predator," Daniel said quietly. "He's a monster." "And he's threatened Becca," Margaret replied. "We need to move faster. Whatever we're planning, we need to do it before he decides she's too dangerous to leave alive." The next morning, Daniel called a meeting. Becca, Margaret, Tom, and the 2 junior consultants gathered in the conference room, their faces reflecting varying degrees of anxiety and determination. Daniel stood at the head of the table, Henry's letter in his pocket like a talisman, and laid out the plan. "We're going to bring Victor Crane down," he said, "not through violence, not through illegal means, but through the truth. We have evidence of fraud, intimidation, and potentially much worse. We have witnesses willing to testify, and we have something Victor doesn't have: each other." He turned to Becca, who sat with her hands folded on the table, her expression unreadable. "This is going to be hard. It's going to mean going public with your story, facing Victor in court, reliving things you'd rather forget. I won't ask you to do that. It has to be your choice." Becca was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but soft. "All my life I've been running. Running from my father, who thought daughters were property. Running from Sophie's father, who thought commitment was optional. Running from Victor, who thought desperation meant consent. I'm tired of running, Daniel. I'm tired of letting men like him win, because fighting back is too hard." She stood, and there was a new fire in her eyes, the flame of someone who had found a cause worth burning for. "I'll testify. I'll tell my story to anyone who will listen. And if Victor thinks he can silence me the way he silenced the others, he's going to learn that some women don't break. Some women bend until they look like they're defeated, and then they spring back and knock you on your ass." The room erupted in spontaneous applause. Even Margaret, who rarely showed emotion, was blinking rapidly in a way that suggested tears she would never admit to shedding. Daniel felt his own throat tighten with pride and something deeper, something that felt like hope. The legal battle that followed was brutal and prolonged. Victor, as expected, fought with every weapon at his disposal. He hired the best lawyers money could buy, launched countersuits alleging defamation and conspiracy, and attempted to discredit Becca and the other witnesses through a campaign of character assassination that filled the local newspapers with insinuations and lies. For weeks, it seemed like he might succeed. His money and connections created barriers that seemed insurmountable, and more than once Daniel wondered if they had taken on a fight they could not win. The turning point came on a gray February morning when a woman named Catherine Shaw walked into Daniel's office unannounced. She was in her 60s, elegantly dressed with silver hair and eyes that held the kind of steel that comes from surviving things most people cannot imagine. She introduced herself as Victor Crane's former wife, and she had come to offer her testimony. "I was married to that man for 15 years, Catherine said, her voice calm but underlaid with old pain. "I saw everything. The deals, the threats, the women he brought into our home under the guise of business meetings. I stayed silent because I was afraid, because he convinced me that no one would believe me, that he would destroy me if I ever spoke out. But I've been watching what you're doing, Mr. Harrison. I've seen the courage of these women who are finally telling the truth. And I realize that my silence makes me complicit. I can't carry that weight anymore." Catherine's testimony was devastating. She had kept records, photographs, recordings that Victor never knew existed. She had documented his affairs, his bribes, his intimidation tactics with the meticulous attention to detail of someone who knew she might need insurance someday. When she took the stand in the civil trial that Becca and the other women had filed, her evidence was irrefutable. Victor's empire began to crumble. Business partners distanced themselves. Investors demanded audits. Regulatory agencies that had looked the other way for years suddenly found reason to investigate. The criminal referral came 3 weeks after Catherine's testimony, when the district attorney announced that Victor Crane was being charged with fraud, extortion, and 3 counts of involuntary manslaughter in connection with the deaths of the women who had died under suspicious circumstances. Daniel watched the news coverage from his office, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. They had won, or at least they had won this battle. Victor would face justice for at least some of his crimes. The women he had victimized would have their day in court, their voices finally heard after years of enforced silence. But victory, Daniel was learning, rarely felt as clean or as complete as he had imagined it would. Becca appeared in his doorway, Sophie holding her hand. The little girl had grown in the months since Daniel first saw her at the restaurant, her cheeks round and healthy, her eyes bright with the uncomplicated joy of childhood. She ran to Daniel and hugged his legs, a gesture of affection that had become routine in recent weeks. "We came to say thank you," Becca said. "Not just for what you did with Victor, but for everything, for seeing me when I was invisible, for offering help without strings, for believing I was worth fighting for." Daniel crouched to Sophie's level, accepting her hug with the easy warmth of someone who had learned to treasure such moments. "You don't need to thank me. You did the fighting, you found the courage. All I did was open a door. You did more than that." Becca's voice caught, and she paused to collect herself. "You showed me that the world isn't what I thought it was, that there are good people, people who help because it's right and not because they want something. I spent so long believing that everyone had an angle, that kindness was just manipulation in disguise. You proved me wrong, you and Margaret, and everyone here." She crossed to where Daniel stood and did something she had never done before. She hugged him. Not the formal, distant embrace of colleagues, but a real hug, the kind that communicates gratitude too deep for words. Daniel returned it, gently aware of how far they had both come from that first encounter at the restaurant. "What will you do now?" he asked when she stood up back. "Keep working if you'll have me. Keep building the life Sophie deserves. And maybe," she hesitated as though afraid to voice the thought, "maybe start helping other women who are where I was. I've been talking to some of the survivors from the trial. They want to create a support network, a place where women who've been through what we've been through can find resources and community and hope. I'd like to be part of that." Daniel smiled, feeling the rightness of the moment settle into his bones. This was what Henry had meant, what paying it forward truly looked like. Not a single act of generosity, but a chain of them, each link forged by someone who had received help and chose to extend it to another. "I think that's exactly what you should do," he said. "And if you need resources, space, anything I can provide, it's yours." The support network Becca helped create launched 6 months later, operating out of a small office space that Daniel donated rent-free. They called it the Ripple Project, a name Becca had chosen to honor the philosophy that had saved her life. In its first year, the organization helped over 200 women escape abusive situations, find employment, and rebuild their lives. Catherine Shaw became a major donor and board member, channeling the wealth she had received in her divorce settlement into the cause that had brought her out of silence. Margaret volunteered as an advisor, bringing her decades of administrative experience to bear on the practical challenges of running a nonprofit. Even Grace and Sophie got involved, organizing toy drives and bake sales with the enthusiastic energy of children who had learned early that helping others was not just good, but joyful. Daniel watched the organization grow with quiet pride, but he remained deliberately in the background. This was Becca's achievement, her transformation from victim to advocate, and he did not want his presence to overshadow her accomplishment. She had earned every bit of the respect and recognition she was receiving, and she deserved to stand in the spotlight without sharing it. On the one-year anniversary of the Ripple Project's founding, Becca invited Daniel to speak at the celebration dinner. He resisted at first, uncomfortable with public attention, but she insisted. "These women need to hear your story," she said. "They need to know that men can be part of the solution, that not everyone who offers help has an ulterior motive. You're living proof that kindness without strings exists. Please, Daniel, do it for them." He agreed, and on a warm September evening, he stood before an audience of survivors, supporters, and community members in the ballroom of a downtown hotel. The faces looking up at him were diverse in age and background, but united by a common thread. They had all been touched, directly or indirectly, by the work that Becca and her team had done. Daniel cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice carrying across the silent room. 23 years ago, I was homeless. I was sleeping in my car with my infant daughter and wondering how I was going to feed her, wondering if I was going to lose her to a system that would judge me unfit because I couldn't provide. I had lost my wife, my job, my home, everything except the tiny human who depended on me for survival. I was one bad day away from giving up completely. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. In the front row, Becca sat with Sophie on her lap, both of them watching with rapt attention. Then I met a man named Henry Callahan. He owned a small restaurant on the edge of town, nothing fancy, but it had a reputation for treating people right. I went in looking for a job, carrying my baby daughter, reeking of desperation and failure. Most people would have shown me the door. Henry sat me down and made me a meal. Then he offered me a job, a place to bring my daughter while I worked, a chance to rebuild my life with dignity instead of shame. He didn't ask for anything in return except honest work. He didn't make me feel like a charity case or a burden. He just saw a fellow human being who was struggling and decided to help. Daniel's eyes found the photograph of Henry that had been placed on a small table near the podium, surrounded by flowers. The old man's smile seemed to reach across the years, offering encouragement from beyond the grave. Henry taught me that real help doesn't diminish people. It doesn't create obligations or keep score. It sees someone in pain and offers what they need without making them feel small for needing it. That lesson changed my life. It's the reason I have a successful business, a beautiful daughter, a life worth living, and it's the reason I was able to help Becca when she needed it most. He turned to look at her directly, and she met his gaze with tears streaming down her face. "But here's what I want you to understand. I didn't save Becca. She saved herself. I opened a door, but she walked through it. I offered opportunity, but she seized it with both hands and built something extraordinary. The Ripple Project exists because of her courage, her determination, her refusal to let the worst things that happened to her define the rest of her life. I'm honored to have played a small part in her journey, but make no mistake, she is the hero of her own story." The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of appreciation that seemed to shake the walls. Becca rose from her seat and crossed to the podium, pulling Daniel into an embrace that communicated everything words could not express. Then she took the microphone and addressed the crowd. "When I met Daniel Harrison, I was convinced that everyone who offered help wanted something in return. I had been used, manipulated, betrayed by people who disguised exploitation as kindness. I was ready to spend the rest of my life alone rather than risk being hurt again. Daniel showed me another way. He showed me that trust can be rebuilt, that not everyone keeps score, that sometimes people help simply because it's right." She turned to face the room, her voice growing stronger. "Every woman in this room has a story of being let down, used, or discarded by someone who should have protected them. Every woman in this room knows what it feels like to believe that the world is against you, that no one can be trusted, that survival means isolation. I'm here to tell you that it doesn't have to be that way. There are good people in the world. There are helpers, healers, people who will stand with you without asking for anything in return. Our job is not just to find them, but to become them, to take the help we've received and pass it on, to create ripples that spread outward until they touch lives we'll never know." She raised her glass and the room followed suit. "To Henry Callahan, who started the ripple. to Daniel Harrison who carried it forward, and to every person in this room who has the courage to keep it going. May we never forget that we are strongest when we lift each other up. The toast echoed through the ballroom, a chorus of voices united in purpose. Daniel felt the moment wash over him, carrying with it the culmination of everything he had worked for since Henry first took a chance on a desperate young father with nothing to offer but willingness to try. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Daniel found himself standing on the hotel balcony, looking out at the city lights. The autumn air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. He felt tired but content, the deep satisfaction of a journey completed and a promise kept. Becca joined him after a few minutes, 2 glasses of wine in her hands. She offered one to him, and they stood together in comfortable silence watching the lights below. "I've been thinking about something," she said finally, "about how this all started. A little girl staring at a plate of chicken tenders in a restaurant. That was the moment that changed everything. Such a small thing, really. You could have looked away. Most people would have." "I couldn't look away," Daniel replied. "Something about Sophie's eyes reminded me of my own daughter at that age, reminded me of everything I almost lost. I didn't see a stranger in that restaurant. I saw myself 20 years earlier, desperately hoping someone would notice. And now look at us." Becca gestured toward the ballroom behind them, where the last guests were saying their goodbyes. "An organization that's helped hundreds of women, a community of survivors who support each other. Lives changed, futures rewritten, all because you couldn't look away. Not because of me, because of Henry, because he couldn't look away when he saw me standing in his doorway. The ripple started with him, Becca. I just kept it moving." She smiled, and in that smile, Daniel saw the woman she had become, so different from the frightened survivor he had first encountered. She was confident, now purposeful, a leader who inspired others through her example. The transformation was complete, and it was beautiful. "I want to tell you something," she said quietly, "something I've never told anyone. When Sophie was in the hospital, when you paid the bill and stayed with us through those terrible nights, I made a decision. I decided that if we got through that, if Sophie recovered, I would spend the rest of my life being the kind of person you showed me was possible. Someone who helps without keeping score. Someone who sees suffering and responds with action instead of judgment. I made that promise in the hospital chapel at 3 a.m, and I've kept it every day since." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "I didn't know that." "You weren't supposed to. It was between me and whatever power runs this universe. But I wanted you to know now tonight, because this anniversary feels like a completion of something. A circle closing. I made a promise and I kept it, and now I'm watching other women make the same promise and keep it too. The ripple is spreading, Daniel. It's bigger than either of us now." She set down her wine glass and turned to face him fully. "Thank you, not just for the room or the apartment or the hospital bill. Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Thank you for being patient when I was difficult. Thank you for showing Sophie what a good man looks like, so she'll know to expect that from the men in her own life. You've given us more than you'll ever know." Daniel reached out and took her hand, holding it gently. "You've given me something too, Becca. You've shown me that Henry's lessons are still alive, still working, still changing lives. I spent years wondering if I was doing enough to honor his memory. Now I know. The best way to honor someone who helped you is to help someone else. You've proved that beyond any doubt." They stood together as the last lights in the ballroom went dark, 2 people who had found each other at the intersection of need and generosity, bound by a chain of kindness that stretched back decades and would stretch forward for decades more. The night was quiet around them, but neither felt alone. They were part of something larger now, a current of compassion that flowed through time and space, touching lives they would never meet, changing futures they would never see. The ripple continued to spread. Sophie found them on the balcony a few minutes later, tugging at her mother's dress with the impatient energy of a child ready for bed. Grace was with her, the 2 girls having formed a friendship that Daniel hoped would last a lifetime. They had so much in common, these daughters of survivors, and so much ahead of them. "Mama, I'm tired," Sophie announced. "Can we go home now?" "Yes, baby, we can go home." Home. The word carried a weight it had not held a year ago when home was a cramped motel room and the future was a fog of uncertainty. Now home was a real apartment with real furniture filled with the accumulated evidence of a life being built rather than merely survived. Becca gathered her daughter in her arms and turned to Daniel one last time. "Same time next year," she asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I wouldn't miss it." She walked away, Sophie's head resting on her shoulder, and Daniel watched until they disappeared through the ballroom doors. Then he turned back to the city lights, feeling the cool breeze on his face and the warm satisfaction of a promise fulfilled. In his pocket, Henry's letter crinkled softly, a reminder of the man who had started it all. Daniel pulled it out and read it one more time, the familiar words washing over him like a benediction. "Don't let him take whatever good you've done in the years since we met. The people you've helped, the lives you've touched, those are your legacy, not your vulnerability." He folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket. Then he took out his phone and dialed a number he had not called in months. "Hello." The voice on the other end was groggy with sleep. "Grace, it's Dad. I know it's late, but I wanted to tell you something." "Dad, it's midnight. Is everything okay?" "Everything is perfect. I just wanted to say that I love you and I'm proud of the person you are becoming. And I wanted to thank you for being patient with me all these years, for understanding why I do the things I do, for being my reason to keep going when things were hard." There was a pause, and when Grace spoke again, her voice was soft with emotion. "I love you too, Dad, and I'm proud of you. What you've done for Becca and Sophie, what you've built with the Ripple Project, it matters. It makes a difference. That's all I ever wanted, to make a difference, to honor what Henry gave me by giving it to others. You have, Dad, you really have." They talked for a few more minutes, the easy conversation of a father and daughter who had weathered storms together and emerged stronger for it. When Daniel finally hung up, he felt lighter than he had in years, as though a weight he had not known he was carrying had finally been lifted. He left the hotel and walked to his car, the night air crisp and clean around him. As he drove home through the quiet streets, he thought about ripples and circles and the strange mathematics of kindness. One man helps another, who helps another, who helps another, each act of generosity creating waves that spread outward in patterns too complex to trace. Henry had helped Daniel, who had helped Becca, who was now helping hundreds of women who would in turn help others. The chain was unbroken and growing, a living testament to the power of compassion freely given. At home, Buster greeted him with the enthusiastic welcome that never grew old. Daniel knelt to scratch behind the dog's ears, letting the simple joy of the moment wash over him. Then he walked to his study and sat down at his desk, where the photograph of Henry waited, as it always did. "We did it, old friend," Daniel said softly. "We beat Victor, we built something meaningful, and the ripple is still spreading. I hope wherever you are, you can see what's become of the scared young man you took a chance on all those years ago. I hope you're proud." The photograph, of course, did not answer, but Daniel could have sworn he saw Henry's smile grow just a little bit wider in the lamplight. He turned off the lamp and went to bed, his heart full and his conscience clear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help, new chances to keep the ripple spreading. But tonight he would rest secure in the knowledge that he had done what Henry asked. He had paid it forward, and the ripple would never stop.